How's it going, guys? I'm John. You're watching Use of Thirds, and I just finished reading Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. This episode of Turning Pages might be a little bit more of a deep dive compared to some of our other book reviews, as it is a novelization, there is a film version, so I'll be doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting here. The first half-ish of this video is going to be spoiler-free, and I'll let you know when I'll be getting into the spoiler section. And you might be asking, well, John, how can there be spoilers for a novelization of a movie that only came out 2 years ago? And whoo boy, let me tell you. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is Quentin Tarantino's first official novel, while also acting as a novelization for his film of the same name. However, it does make some serious departures from the film in terms of story structure, dialogue, and, well, the ending, which is hardly a spoiler. It's told in third-person perspective, but in the present tense, which definitely took some getting used to while reading it, but naturally, as a screenplay writer, it also just makes sense that Tarantino would feel most comfortable writing in the present tense. This makes his writing, despite being in a novel format, feel very much like you're watching one of his films, because, as we all know, Tarantino's voice is incredibly present in his films, and you can almost feel him speaking through each of his characters when they recite his dialogue, and you can literally hear him speaking in narrations in The Hateful Eight. This feels a lot like that. He's very much the omniscient, all-knowing narrator here. This book does jump around quite a bit on the timeline of events. I've said before that I think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, as far as the structure goes, is the closest thing he's done to Pulp Fiction. And I don't only say that because they both follow an ensemble of characters with alternate perspectives. I'm specifically talking about the tone of the story and the way the timeline is structured, plus they're both set in LA. The biggest difference in structure is that in Pulp Fiction, it's almost like he's more interested in carrying the story forward through shifting the tone and creating an engaging or fun sequence, and less so by advancing the plot through details and information. You get this series of seemingly standalone scenes, some that even take place after the final scene in the movie, but Quentin chooses to end on a climactic note, where what was set up in the opening scene can now finally be paid off. And we get this nice little send-off for Jules and Vincent as they walk coolly out of the diner with the briefcase. But they still look like a couple of dorks, and the credits roll. In Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there is a core timeline. At least, there is in the novelization, and I think that core timeline might be a bit more fuzzy in the film version. But there are multiple chapters that will leap forward, and even more that leap backward in time to establish the origins of a lot of characters that we don't really get any of in the movie. And sometimes this book will stop mid-chapter and jump to a different point in the timeline, then jump back to the present. It's a bit weird, but you get used to it as you're reading it. I think it's actually easier to follow than Pulp Fiction, which, like I was saying, feels like a series of standalone sequences kind of thrown into a blender, and then as an audience member, you're sort of forced to piece those sequences back together like a puzzle. Quentin can definitely tend to self-indulge a bit, and here he does it a lot. This thing is chock full of references to 1950s and 60s Hollywood, but it's not constricted to those decades. It even jumps forward as far as the 80s and 90s at times. So yes, he really is an omnipresent narrator here who seems to know everything about film history ever. And I know Tarantino is a walking film encyclopedia, but having read this, he had to have done so much research that it's actually quite insane. There were tons of names and references to movies that I had never heard of, and I constantly found myself pulling up Google to look up whether it was real or fictional. This book really does that to you. At least for me, it was very difficult to tell what was historical truth and what was a product of the mind of Quentin Tarantino. All in all, if you're a fan of his movies, I would definitely recommend giving it a read. That being said, I would recommend seeing the film first. It really is more of a companion than a novelization, and I'll go more into that later in this video. But be ready for changes, particularly within the way the story is presented. The structure, the dialogue, the who said whats. For his first ever novel, I thought it was very good and a very entertaining read. Especially having seen the film, I was easily able to imagine Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Margot Robbie, Timothy Olyphant, etc. in their far more expanded upon roles that are in the novel. The book also made me laugh a lot. A lot of the dialogue and even Quentin's prose is just so damn funny, and I think it helps that I've seen all of his movies and I know his sort of style, I know his voice, so it was fun to catch all the little Tarantino-isms along the way. But definitely check it out, it's a solid read, especially if you're interested in film history. Spoilers. Now, getting into some characters, let's talk about Sharon Tate. She gets a little more time than she does in the movie version, but not much, and if she did, honestly, she would be the only non-fictional character to be anything other than a minor supporting role or even a big name dropped in a casual conversation, just to help bring to life and help authenticate Tarantino's interpretation of 1960s Hollywood. What Sharon Tate does get are some small scenes with Roman throughout, and a backstory fairly early on, where she's hitchhiking and she's given a ride from Texas to New Mexico. She's on her way to LA to try and hit the film scene and make it big, only it isn't revealed to us that it's Sharon until the end of the chapter. I thought this was a great way to introduce her character. The book also spends a lot more time with Charlie and the Manson family. If you've seen the film, you know that Charlie gets one brief scene at the Polanski residence, and aside from that, there's only mention of him from the girls. Here Quentin uses a fictional character as a vessel to introduce Charlie and to show the way that he initiated and manipulated the girls into his cult or his family. That character is Pussycat, who is also very prominently in the film. She's utilized significantly more here, which was one of the aspects that I certainly did not expect, and also one of the more disturbing aspects. Not only due to the historical context, but also because Tarantino actively creates fictional scenarios with a fictional underage character that don't necessarily affect the plot of the overall story. And yeah, it's kind of weird. Being problematic is nothing new for Tarantino, obviously, but there's something about writing on the page where the voice of the author really speaks through. Writing is far more literal than film, and there were some scenes, some chapters in this book that made me genuinely uncomfortable. And that was the intent, I'm sure. Specifically when dealing with the Manson family, you want to be as historically accurate as possible, but in this book it's very difficult to distinguish between historical accuracy and the fictional elements. He's obviously doing this in order to further develop the wickedness of Charles Manson and the manipulative power he held over the young girls in his cult. But I'm really not sure the lengths he went to were necessary here, particularly due to the age of the character in question. During that initiation scene, Pussycat can hear Charlie's voice in her head, commanding her to sneak into the house of an elderly couple. Despite the problematic nature of the scene, this is actually handled very effectively in the writing and does a great job at portraying just how brainwashed she and the other girls were by Charlie. There's also the scene between her and Cliff Booth in the car, which in the film, she asks if he wants her to go down on him while he's driving, and he declines due to her being underaged. Let's just say the book takes it a whole lot further than that. And ultimately Cliff declines, which at least that's the same as in the film. Otherwise, I honestly don't know if there would be any redeeming qualities to his character, and I mean this, Cliff Booth is the absolute worst person in this entire book. We spend significantly more time with his character here, especially dealing with his past in World War II and after. I think I'm beginning to understand Tarantino's intentions with Booth's character a bit more now that I've read it, but I'm still not 100%. Throughout the novel, one thing that is repeatedly touched on regarding Cliff is that he is a stone-cold killer. We get multiple backstory chapters for Cliff, and each one is there specifically to establish what he has done and what he is capable of. He's also frequently presented with opportunities to take advantage of and manipulate other people, particularly women. And it is made clear, especially during a scene where a French pimp breaks down what exactly he does and how the job works, that line of work and that level of manipulation and control over other humans is actually attractive to Cliff as a character. Like, after listening to the guy, Cliff legitimately debates becoming a full-time pimp when he returns to the States. It's wild. Getting into the Bruce Lee scene. Now, first and foremost, I want to say that I don't really have any nostalgia or emotional attachment to Bruce Lee. That being said, I do think artists have a level of responsibility when portraying the deceased. However, I don't think that Tarantino really crossed any lines here. You can watch any interview of Bruce Lee, and it's clear that he really was as egotistic of a person as he was in Tarantino's portrayal. It's also painfully clear that, especially once you've read the novelization, that shitting on Bruce Lee was not in any way Quentin Tarantino's intent with that particular scene that got him oh so much flack upon the film's initial release. The reason I say that is that it's not even about Lee, it's about Cliff Booth. And I cannot stress this enough, it is about Cliff being a killer. This is one of the many backstory chapters we get for Cliff. If anything, it's kind of a compliment to Bruce Lee, and I say that because Tarantino picked the biggest badass in Hollywood at the time, somebody that everyone respected and believed could not be beat, and then he writes a fictional character who can beat him. That's the point. The entire scene exists to serve Cliff and his development as someone who is not to be trifled with. Not even by the likes of Bruce fucking Lee. So why go to all those lengths to establish Cliff as a killer? Now, this is just my opinion. This is my interpretation. But what it seems like to me is that with Cliff's character, Quentin is crafting a monster comparable to that of Charles Manson. Only one that you wouldn't point out on the street and say, hey, look at that dirty fucking hippie. Cliff is an all-American monster, a Green Beret with 2 Medals of Valor. He's someone attractive and likable. He's the cool, rebellious rule breaker on the surface while being a racist, sexist killer underneath. He's the depiction of the modern American hero in the same period as Charles Manson, and yet because Manson is a crazy hippie cult leader, the public views him as being worse. But the truth is, even though Cliff is likable and kicks ass, and has the medals to prove it, he's just as horrible of a monster as Charles Manson. Maybe that's a hot take, I'm not sure, but that's my interpretation and I'm going to stick with it. I actually found myself caring for Rick's character more in the book than in the movie. Yes, he's pathetic. And he's supposed to be. But we as the audience actually want to see him succeed in his acting career. His character is especially expanded upon through the Lancer show that we see a bit of in the movie, but we get a whole lot more of it in the book. I do think the Lancer chapters were some of the slower chapters, and they're also some of the chapters where Tarantino becomes the most self-indulgent, as well as the scenes between Rick and his agent. This is where he gets full-on masturbatory, going to the lengths of leaping forward on the timeline to the 1990s just to inform us, the reader, that Quentin Tarantino exists within his own meta-universe and has directed a film starring a much older Trudy Frazier, aka Mirabella Lancer. There's even a moment, I forget the context, but Tarantino literally writes a kid named Quentin into the story at one point and feels the need to describe the kid's t-shirt as having the words "Quentin is cool" written across the front. Like holy shit, dude. So the Lancer show is mostly there to introduce Trudy Frazier and establish a contrasting relationship between her, an upcoming child actress who seems to have it all figured out, and Rick, a failing has-been who doesn't seem to understand the industry much at all. Now, were the earlier scenes involving an underage pussycat not in the story, I would view their dynamic as simply a generational one, or a paternal father-daughter, or even a teacher-mentor dynamic, but flipped on its head. But because those other scenes are in the story, I couldn't help but question Tarantino's intent here regarding their relationship. The Lancer scenes slowed the book down for me a bit, but I also think they do the best at driving home what the story is really about. I love the moment between Rick and Trudy when they're talking about Easy Breezy, this fictional character that Rick is referring to when he's actually talking about himself and his own struggles. Trudy asks what part he's at in the book he's reading, in which Rick responds, about midway. What's great about this is that in both the movie and the book version, the line is delivered almost exactly halfway through. Also, another great thing is the way he presents the on-set scenes in both the film and the novel version. In the movie, we literally go into the scene and can hear the director and AD making calls from behind the camera. The same thing happens in the book, only it's through prose instead of visuals. So you don't always know when you're in the external Hollywood world of the story, or if you're immersed in the internal Lancer world of the story, where Rick is Caleb and Trudy is Mirabella. The book ends differently than the movie, and that's definitely the biggest standout departure. We end with a scene between Rick and Trudy rehearsing their lines over the phone before their big shoot the following day. Whereas in the movie, we get this big overblown sequence of violence as we have come to expect from the climaxes of Tarantino. That big finale sequence is actually brushed over in a short paragraph about a third of the way into the book. And it's really strange because it stops mid-chapter to jump forward 7 months later on the timeline and explain that a group of hippies broke into the house on CeeLo Drive, and then Rick and Cliff were forced to brutally murder them. So it makes me think that the book ending was the original ending to the story, and that the Manson family break-in was really just a cinematic set piece. Same with the cigarette dipped in acid. It's funny, and visually it works as a quick cutaway for comedic effect, but the detail is nowhere to be found in the book. Also not in the book is the scene at Spawn Ranch, where Clem slashes Cliff's tires and gets the shit kicked out of him for it. The whole ranch scene is actually from Squeaky Fromm's perspective, which was an interesting choice. But if the book ending was the original ending, then that begs the question, why spend so much time establishing Cliff as a killer? Why write an entire backstory chapter a la Princess Bride, breaking down the dogfights where Cliff came to own Brandy, his pet pit bull? This really reminded me of the Fezzik and Inigo origin chapters in the Princess Bride novel for some reason. But the whole purpose of building up the dog as this undefeated champion, like the repeated establishing that Cliff is a stone-cold killer, you'd think would be to serve that final climactic confrontation between them and the Manson family. But if that scene isn't even there, what's the point? What's the point of Brandy the dog, or the French pimp, or the Natalie Wood-esque wife murder scene, or even the Bruce Lee scene? So there are some pretty significant departures from the film, that's for sure. And it seems that, for the most part, these departures were well thought out, but I've got some questions. Quentin. Regardless, am I glad I took the time to read this novelization? Absolutely. Was it great to see a well-known filmmaker take a whack at writing a novel while injecting their own personal style into a new medium? Absolutely. The reason I say this feels more like a companion to the film as opposed to just a novelization is that I don't think this book works too well on its own, but I'd be very curious to hear the opinion of someone who read the book prior to seeing the movie. Although I honestly don't really think anyone would do that, because Tarantino is first and foremost a filmmaker. That's just what he's known for. And the ending isn't all that satisfying on its own. It's satisfying because we've seen the movie, and because we know how the story goes. There's ultimately more setup in the book and less payoff. But we get the payoff in the movie. So it's probably best to view the book as an expansion upon what we saw more than anything else. In both versions, we end on a note of hope for the future life and career of one Rick Dalton. That is what ultimately matters. We're left wishing that reality had taken this turn, and wondering how the life of Sharon Tate, how Hollywood would have gone on if not for that wicked night on CeeLo Drive. My name's John. Thanks for checking out Use of Thirds.